James Whitmore's hands plunged into the soapy water, a stark contrast to the manicured fingers that usually graced boardroom tables. The cacophony of the kitchen swirled around him, clanging pots, sizzling pans, and barked orders. He scrubbed a stubborn spot on a copper pot, his mind racing faster than his hands. "Hey, new guy, we need those pans ASAP." The head chef's voice cut through the din. James looked up, meeting Lucas Donovan's intense gaze. On it, chef. As he worked, James' thoughts drifted to the events that led him here. The unexplained discrepancies in the hotel's books, the whispers of discontent among the staff, the nagging feeling that someone close to him was orchestrating it all. He glanced around the kitchen, observing the controlled chaos. Sous chefs barked orders, line cooks moved with practiced precision, and servers darted in and out, balancing trays of exquisite cuisine. To them, he was just another faceless worker, invisible in the hierarchy of hotel operations. A commotion near the kitchen entrance caught his attention. Eli Carter, the head of hotel security, strode in, his presence immediately tensing the atmosphere. "Sophia wants to see you, Lucas," Eli announced, his eyes scanning the kitchen with suspicion. Lucas wiped his hands on his apron. "Now, we're in the middle of dinner service." "Now," Eli confirmed, his tone brooking no argument. As Lucas left, James inched closer to Eli, pretending to clean nearby surfaces. He caught snippets of a hushed conversation between Eli and one of the sous chefs. "Staff cuts coming. Need to tighten our belts." "But we're already stretched thin," the sous chef protested. Eli's voice dropped lower. "It's not my call. Take it up with management if you've got a problem." James filed away this information, his suspicions growing. Something was rotten in the state of Whitmore hotels, and he was determined to root it out. Hours passed, and as the kitchen staff began to thin out, James found himself alone with Lucas, who was meticulously cleaning his workspace. "You're new here, right?" Lucas asked, breaking the silence. James nodded, careful to maintain his cover. "Started this week, James. James Smith." Lucas extended a hand. "Lucas Donovan, head chef. You're doing good work, James. Keep it up." As they worked side by side, Lucas opened up about the recent changes in the hotel. "Things used to be different around here," he sighed. "The Whitmores, they built this place on family values. Now, it's all about the bottom line." James' ears perked up. "The Whitmores." Lucas chuckled. "Right, you're new. The Whitmore family owns this whole chain. James Whitmore's the big boss, but we never see him down here in the trenches." "If only you knew," James thought. "Lately, it's all been Sophia Green and Eli Carter running the show," Lucas continued. "And let me tell you, they're running it into the ground." Before James could probe further, Eli burst back into the kitchen, his face twisted with anger. "You." He pointed at James. "These pots are filthy. Do them again." James bit back a retort, reminding himself of his role. "Yes, sir." Eli loomed over him, clearly relishing the power dynamic. "And make it quick. We don't pay you to daydream." As Eli stormed out, Lucas shook his head. "Don't let him get to you. He's been on a power trip ever since he got promoted." James nodded, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the full picture remained elusive. As the night wound down, James found himself alone in the kitchen, finishing up the last of the cleaning. A hushed conversation from the corridor caught his attention. "Everything's in place," Sophia's voice drifted in. "The board meeting is set for next week. Once we present the numbers, James won't know what hit him." Eli's gravelly tone responded, "And you're sure David's on board?" "Completely," Sophia confirmed. "He's been waiting for this opportunity for years." James' blood ran cold. David, his own brother. He leaned closer to the door, straining to hear more, but a sudden clatter of pans startled him. By the time he regained his composure, Sophia and Eli were gone. James slumped against the wall, his mind reeling. The betrayal cut deep, but he couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. He needed proof, and he needed it fast. As he gathered his things to leave, his eyes fell on a framed photo hanging in the staff area. It showed him and David at the hotel's grand opening, arms around each other, smiles wide and genuine. James stared at it, a mix of anger and sadness washing over him. "Oh, David," he whispered, "what have you done?" The next morning, James arrived early, determined to gather more information. He'd barely started his shift when a commotion at the kitchen entrance caught everyone's attention. David Whitmore, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, strode in, his charisma filling the room. James ducked his head, focusing intently on the dishes before him. "Good morning, everyone." David's voice boomed. "I just wanted to stop by and thank you all for your hard work. We've got some exciting changes coming up, and I know I can count on each of you to help make them a success." James watched from the corner of his eye as David worked the room, shaking hands and patting backs. His brother's charm was on full display, but James could see the calculation behind every smile, every gesture. As David made his way towards the sink, James tensed. Would his brother recognize him? "And you must be new," David said, extending his hand. "David Whitmore, welcome to the family." James looked up, meeting his brother's eyes. For a split second, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition, but it passed so quickly he couldn't be sure. "James Smith," he replied, shaking David's hand. "It's an honor, sir." David nodded, already moving on to the next person. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. As the day progressed, James kept a close eye on David's interactions with the staff. He noticed how his brother pulled Eli and Sophia aside for hushed conversations, how certain employees seemed more nervous in David's presence. During a lull in the afternoon, James found himself alone in the dry storage room, taking inventory. As he reached for a box on a high shelf, his elbow knocked against a loose panel in the wall. Curious, he pried it open. Inside, he found a worn leather-bound book. Opening it, his eyes widened. It was a financial ledger, filled with meticulous notes detailing discrepancies in the hotel's accounts. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he snapped a photo of a few pages with his phone and replaced the book, sliding the panel back into place. He turned just as Eli entered the room. "What are you doing in here?" Eli demanded, his eyes narrowing. James held up the inventory clipboard. "Just finishing up the stock count, sir." Eli glared at him for a long moment before grunting and turning away. As he left, a piece of paper fluttered from his pocket. James picked it up, his heart racing, as he recognized his mother's handwriting. It was a letter, addressed to David. "My dear David, I've done as you asked. The papers transferring my shares have been signed. I only hope this helps bring our family back together. James has lost his way, focused only on profits and expansion. It's time for a change. All my love, Mother." James' hands shook as he read the words. The betrayal ran deeper than he could have imagined. As he made his way back to the kitchen, his mind raced with possibilities. How could he expose the truth without revealing his identity? Who could he trust? His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the walk-in freezer. Eli had cornered Lucas, his face red with anger. "I know you've been talking to the new guy," Eli snarled. "What have you told him?" Lucas stood his ground. "I haven't told him anything he couldn't figure out for himself. This place is falling apart, and everyone knows it." Eli grabbed Lucas by the collar, slamming him against the freezer door. "Watch your mouth, chef. You're replaceable, just like everyone else here." James couldn't stand by any longer. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Let him go, Mr. Carter." Eli whirled on him, eyes blazing. "You stay out of this, Dishwasher, unless you want to lose your job too." James met Eli's gaze, years of boardroom confrontations stealing his resolve. "I said, let him go." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Eli released his grip on Lucas. "This isn't over," Eli growled, storming off. Lucas straightened his chef's coat, looking at James with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Thanks, man, but you shouldn't have done that. Eli's got out for you now." James shrugged, his mind already racing ahead. He just made a powerful enemy, but he'd also gained a potential ally in Lucas. As he returned to his station, he caught sight of the family photo again. The smiling faces of him and David seemed to mock him now. James clenched his fists, determination setting in. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. His empire, his family's legacy, hung in the balance. As the day drew to a close, James knew he was running out of time. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but he needed to put them together before it was too late. With one last look at the bustling kitchen, he steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The game was on, and James Whitmore was playing for keeps. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the hotel's polished windows when James slipped through the staff entrance. His muscles ached from yesterday's work, a stark reminder of how far he'd fallen from his cushy CEO lifestyle. But there was no time for self-pity. He had a conspiracy to unravel. As he tied his apron, Lucas burst into the locker room, his face flushed with excitement. "James, you won't believe who's here." James feigned ignorance. "Who?" "David Whitmore himself. Word is he's doing a surprise inspection." James's heart raced. His brother here. This was his chance to observe David up close, to catch him in the act. The kitchen buzzed with nervous energy as David made his rounds. James kept his head down, scrubbing furiously at a pot while straining to hear every word. David's voice carried across the room, smooth as silk. "Excellent work, everyone. I'm impressed with improvements we've made." Improvements? James thought bitterly. What improvements? As David approached, James felt his brother's gaze settle on him. He looked up, meeting David's eyes. For a moment, the world stood still. James searched his brother's face for any sign of recognition, any flicker of the bond they once shared. But David's eyes were cold, calculating. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And you are?" David extended his hand. James swallowed hard. "James Smith, sir. New dishwasher." David's grip was firm, businesslike. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Smith. Keep up the good work." As David moved on, James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His own brother, standing right in front of him, and he hadn't recognized him. The realization stung more than James cared to admit. Throughout the day, James watched David work the room. His brother's charm was undeniable, but now James could see the manipulation behind every smile, every casual touch. David was laying the groundwork for something big, and James was determined to find out what. As the lunch rush died down, James overheard Sophia and Eli in heated conversation near the walk-in freezer. "David's pushing up the timeline," Sophia hissed. "We need to move faster." Eli's response was low, almost inaudible. "What about the board meeting?" "It's been moved up. Next week. We need everything in place by then." James's blood ran cold. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon. He needed to act fast. Later that afternoon, as James was restocking the dry goods, he noticed a door slightly ajar. It led to a small office he'd never seen used. Glancing around to ensure he was alone, he slipped inside. The room was dark, musty. James fumbled for a light switch. As the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, he gasped. The walls were covered in financial documents, spreadsheets, and photos. At the center of it all was a large whiteboard with "Operation Takeover" scrawled across the top. James's eyes darted across the information. Fabricated financial reports, staged employee complaints, a detailed timeline leading up to the board meeting. And there, at the bottom of the board, was his name with a big red X through it. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted James back to reality. He quickly snapped photos with his phone and slipped out, heart pounding. Back in the kitchen, James tried to process what he'd seen. The conspiracy was larger than he'd imagined, and it all led back to David. But why? What had driven his brother to such extremes? As the day wore on, James found himself struggling to maintain his composure. Every glance from Eli felt like an accusation. Every whispered conversation seemed to be about him. During a lull in the evening service, James retreated to the walk-in freezer for a moment of peace. He leaned against the cold metal shelves, closing his eyes and taking deep breaths. The door swung open. James's eyes snapped open to find Eli glaring at him. "What are you doing in here?" Eli's voice was low, dangerous. James straightened up. "Just catching my breath. It's been a long day." Eli stepped closer, invading James's personal space. "I've been watching you, Smith. You ask too many questions. You're always where you shouldn't be." James felt his back press against the shelves. "I'm just trying to do my job." "Are you?" Eli's eyes narrowed. "Or are you here for something else?" Before James could respond, Eli's fist connected with his stomach. James doubled over, gasping for air. "I don't know who you really are," Eli snarled, "but I'm going to find out." The freezer door burst open. Lucas stood there, eyes wide. What the hell is going on here? Eli stepped back, his face a mask of innocence. "Just having a chat with our new friend here." "Right, Smith." James straightened up, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Right. Just a misunderstanding." Lucas looked between them, clearly not buying it. "Eli, I think you're needed upstairs. And James, why don't you take a break? You look like you could use some air." As Eli stalked out, Lucas helped James to the staff room. "You okay, man? What was that about?" James shook his head. "It's nothing. Really." Lucas frowned. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but something's not right here. Be careful, okay?" James nodded, grateful for the chef's concern. If only he knew how deep this rabbit hole went. That night, as James prepared to leave, he noticed David's jacket hanging in the staff room. A piece of paper peeked out from the pocket. James hesitated for a moment, then quickly pulled it out. It was a letter, written in an elegant, elderly hand. "My dearest David, I've done as you asked. The papers transferring my shares of the estate have been signed and notarized. I pray this will help bring our family back together. James has lost his way, focused only on profits and expansion. It's time for a change. All my love, Mother." James stared at the letter, his vision blurring. His own mother, siding with David, the betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. As he made his way home, James's mind raced. He needed to contact Carla, his assistant. She was the only one he could trust now. In the safety of his apartment, James called Carla on a secure line. "It's worse than we thought," he said without preamble. "David's manipulated our mother. He's got her shares now." Carla's sharp intake of breath was audible. "That gives him controlling interest." "Exactly. And there's more. They're planning something big at the board meeting next week. We need to move fast." "What do you need me to do?" James outlined his plan, grateful for Carla's unwavering loyalty. As he hung up, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and near misses. James continued his undercover work, gathering what information he could while trying to avoid Eli's increasingly suspicious gaze. On the third day, disaster struck. James was in the office again, searching for more evidence, when the door suddenly opened. Eli stood there, his face twisted with triumph. "I knew it," Eli growled. "You're no dishwasher." James's mind raced, searching for a way out. But Eli was blocking the only exit. "Who are you really?" Eli demanded, advancing on James. "FBI, corporate spy." James backed up, his hands raised. "You've got it all wrong. I can explain." But Eli wasn't listening. He lunged at James, grabbing him by the shirt. They grappled, crashing into shelves and sending papers flying. James fought back, years of corporate combat training kicking in. He managed to break free of Eli's grip, but the larger man was between him and the door. Just as Eli was about to charge again, a voice rang out. "What the hell is going on here?" Lucas stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. Eli froze, caught off guard. James seized the moment, ducking past both men and out into the hallway. As he ran, he could hear Lucas's confused questions and Eli's angry shouts. But he didn't stop. His cover was blown. He needed a new plan, and fast. Back in his apartment, James paced frantically. Everything was unraveling. his mother's betrayal, David's machinations, and now his own identity compromised. He picked up his phone, dialing Carla's number with shaking hands. "It's over," he said as soon as she answered. "They know." Carla's voice was calm, steadying. "Not yet. It's not. We still have one card left to play." As Carla outlined their last-ditch plan, James felt a mix of desperation and determination. This was it. His last chance to save everything he built, to uncover the truth, and maybe, just maybe, to salvage what was left of his family. Tomorrow was the board meeting. Tomorrow he would face David, not as a dishwasher, but as James Whitmore, CEO and rightful heir to the Whitmore empire. As he hung up, James's gaze fell on the family photo on his desk. He and David, arms around each other, smiling at their mother's birthday years ago. How had they come to this? James picked up the photo, studying his brother's face. "Why, David?" he whispered. "What happened to us?" The silence of his apartment offered no answers. But as James set the photo down, his resolve hardened. Tomorrow, one way or another, he would get his answers, and he would fight for what was rightfully his. The stage was set, the players were in position, and James Whitmore was ready for the fight of his life. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned with an air of impending doom. James straightened his tie, the familiar weight of his tailored suit a stark contrast to the dishwasher's uniform he'd worn for weeks. His fingers trembled slightly as he buttoned his cuffs, the gravity of the situation settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Carla entered, her face a mask of professional calm, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "Everything's in place," she said, handing him a sleek tablet. "I've compiled all the evidence we've gathered. It's not much, but it's a start." James nodded, scrolling through the files. Financial discrepancies, overheard conversations, and grainy photos of clandestine meetings between David, Eli, and Sophia. It was circumstantial at best, but it was all he had. "And the gala preparations?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Carla's lips tightened. "David's taken over. He's invited every major investor and board member. It's clear he's planning something big." James set the tablet down, his jaw clenching. "He wants an audience for my downfall." "We won't let that happen," Carla assured him, her voice firm. As they made their way to the boardroom, the hotel buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Staff members whispered in corners, their conversations dying as James passed. He caught snippets of worried discussions about layoffs and budget cuts. Outside the boardroom, David stood surrounded by a group of board members, his charm on full display. As James approached, the group fell silent. David turned, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Ah, James, so glad you could join us." The boardroom was a battlefield of pressed suits and thinly veiled hostility. James took his seat at the head of the table, acutely aware of the skeptical glances thrown his way. David cleared his throat, standing to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss the future of Whitmore Hotels. Recent irregularities have come to light, and it's clear that new leadership is needed to steer us back on course." James leaned forward, his voice steady despite the rage boiling inside him. "And what irregularities might those be, David?" His brother's smile turned predatory. "Why don't you tell us, James? After all, it's your signature on these documents." David dramatically produced a stack of papers, passing them around the table. James's heart sank as he recognized the fabricated financial reports he'd discovered in the hidden office. For the next hour, James fought a losing battle. Every piece of evidence he presented was countered by David's meticulous preparation. The board members' faces grew increasingly concerned as David wove a tale of mismanagement and embezzlement, all pointing to James. As the meeting drew to a close, James knew he was on the brink of losing everything. The board called for a vote of no confidence to be held at the upcoming gala. James left the boardroom, his mind reeling. He needed air, needed to think. He found himself in the hotel's grand ballroom, where preparations for the gala were in full swing. Amidst the chaos of decorators and caterers, James spotted a familiar face. Lucas, still in his chef's whites, was directing the kitchen staff. "Mr. Whitmore," Lucas called out, surprise evident in his voice. "I didn't expect to see you down here." James managed a weak smile. "Just checking on the preparations. How are things in the kitchen?" Lucas's brow furrowed, tense. "There's talk of strikes, budget cuts. People are scared." Before James could respond, Eli's voice cut through the room. "What are you doing here, Whitmore? This area's off limits during preparations." James turned, his patience wearing thin. "This is still my hotel, Eli. I go where I please." Eli stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Not for long. You should have stayed in the kitchen where you belong." James smithed. The two men stood toe to toe, the air crackling with tension. Lucas looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "What's going on?" Lucas asked. "Mr. Whitmore, what does he mean by James Smith?" James sighed, the weight of his deception heavy on his shoulders. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I haven't been entirely honest with you." Before he could explain further, David's voice rang out across the ballroom. "James, a word, please." With a final apologetic glance at Lucas, James followed his brother to a quiet corner of the room. David's facade of charm dropped the moment they were alone. "What do you think you're doing? Trying to rally the troops?" James stood his ground. "I'm trying to save this company from your greed, David. Why are you doing this? We're family." David's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. "Family. Is that what you call it when you get everything handed to you on a silver platter while I fight for scraps? What are you talking about? We built this empire together." David's eyes flashed with anger. "No, James. You built it. I was always in your shadow, the other Whitmore brother." "Well, not anymore." The brothers stared at each other, years of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface. James saw stranger in his brother's eyes, a man consumed by jealousy and ambition. "It doesn't have to be this way," James pleaded. "We can fix this together." David's smile was razor-sharp. "Oh, but it does, dear brother. And at the gala, everyone will see you for who you really are." With that, David turned on his heel and strode away, leaving James alone with the weight of his words. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic preparation and mounting dread. James and Carla worked tirelessly, gathering what evidence they could to present at the gala. But at every turn, they found roadblocks. Key documents went missing. Witnesses suddenly became unavailable. Even the hidden office James had discovered was emptied, leaving no trace of the damning evidence he'd seen. The night before the gala, James sat in his office, surrounded by scattered papers and cold coffee. Carla entered, her usual composure cracking under the strain. "James, I don't know what else we can do. They've covered their tracks too well." James rubbed his eyes, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "There has to be something we've missed, some piece of evidence they couldn't erase." Carla hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "There might be one thing. I've been recording conversations just in case. It's not much, but—" James's eyes widened as he listened to the audio. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. "Carla, you're a genius. This might be enough to buy us some time at the gala." As they finalized their plan, a commotion outside caught their attention. They rushed to the window to see a crowd of hotel staff gathered in the parking lot, holding signs and chanting. "What's going on?" James asked, his heart sinking. Carla's face was grim. "It's a strike. Eli and Sophia must have pushed them over the edge." James watched as Lucas tried to calm the crowd, his usually cheerful face etched with worry. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of his empire. The day of the gala arrived, bringing with it a sense of finality. James stood in his office, adjusting his bow tie and steeling himself for the battle ahead. A soft knock at the door announced Carla's arrival. "It's time," she said softly. As they made their way to the grand ballroom, James caught sight of his reflection in a mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. Gone was the confident CEO, replaced by a man on the brink of losing everything. The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and polished shoes. Investors, board members, and high society elites mingled, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension thrumming through James's veins. David stood at the center of all, holding court like a king among his subjects. As James entered, a hush fell over the room. David's smile was triumphant as he raised his glass. "Ah, the man of the hour. Ladies and gentlemen, my brother, James Whitmore." The crowd's applause was tepid, uncertain. James forced a smile, making his way through the throng of people. He could feel their eyes on him, judging, questioning. As the night wore on, James bided his time. He watched as David worked the room, whispering in ears and shaking hands. The vote of no confidence loomed, a sword of Damocles hanging over James's head. Finally, David took the stage, tapping his glass for attention. "Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, we're here tonight not just to celebrate 50 years of Whitmore Hotels, but to usher in a new era." James tensed, knowing what was coming next. David's voice dripped with false sincerity. "It pains me to say this, but recent events have made it clear that a change in leadership is necessary. I call for a vote of no confidence in James Whitmore as CEO of Whitmore Hotels." A murmur rippled through the crowd. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was it, his last chance. "Before we vote," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I think there's something you all need to hear." James nodded to Carla, who pressed play on her phone. The room filled with the sound of David's voice, discussing plans to manipulate stock prices and siphon funds. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps of shock, angry mutters, and confused whispers filled the air. David's face contorted with rage. This is a trick, a desperate ploy by a failing CEO. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. As the recording ended, James faced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've made mistakes. I've been too trusting, too focused on the big picture to see the betrayal right under my nose. But I assure you, I have only ever acted in the best interests of this company and its people." He turned to David, his voice softening. "Brother, it doesn't have to be this way. We can fix this together." For a moment, something flickered in David's eyes. Regret, shame. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold fury. "You've ruined everything," David snarled, lunging at James. The crowd gasped as the brothers grappled, years of pent-up resentment exploding in a flurry of fists and accusations. Security rushed in, pulling them apart. As they were separated, James caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. His mother, Margaret, her eyes wide with shock and disappointment. In that moment, as he stood surrounded by the wreckage of his family and his empire, James realized that winning this battle might cost him everything he held dear. The room buzzed with shocked conversations and hurried phone calls. The gala was in chaos, the future of Whitmore Hotels hanging in the balance. As security led David away, James straightened his jacket, his mind racing. He had exposed the plot, but at what cost? The real fight was just beginning, and James knew that the path ahead would be the hardest he'd ever faced. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, once a beacon of luxury and refinement, now resembled a battlefield. Shattered champagne flutes littered the floor, their contents seeping into the plush carpet. The air, thick with tension, crackled with whispered conversations and shocked gasps. James Whitmore stood at the center of the chaos, his tailored suit disheveled, a thin trickle of blood running from his split lip. Across from him, David glared with unbridled fury, held back by two burly security guards. Margaret Whitmore's voice cut through the din, sharp and accusatory. "James, how could you? Your own brother." James turned to face his mother, his heart sinking at the disappointment etched across her face. "Mother, please. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Margaret interrupted, her voice quavering. "David was right about you. All you care about is money and power." David's smug smile only fueled James's desperation. He scanned the room, searching for a friendly face among the sea of judgmental stares. His eyes landed on Carla, who gave him a subtle nod. It was now or never. James straightened his tie and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and colleagues, I owe you all an explanation. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on James. For the past month, I've been working undercover in this very hotel, as a dishwasher. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. James caught Lucas's eye, watching as realization dawned on the chef's face. I discovered irregularities in our finances, heard rumors of discontent among our staff. What I uncovered was far worse than I could have imagined. A conspiracy to undermine this company, orchestrated by those I trusted most. David's face contorted with rage. This is absurd. He's lying to save his own skin. James held up a hand, silencing his brother. I have proof. With a nod to Carla, the lights dimmed, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. The crowd watched in stunned silence as a series of video clips played out before them. David, caught on camera discussing embezzlement schemes with Eli and Sophia. Manipulated financial documents flashed across the screen. Recordings of hushed conversations in dark corners of the hotel, laying bare the entire conspiracy. As the final clip faded to black, the room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted accusations, investors demanded explanations, and in the center of it all, David stood frozen, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. Margaret's voice, small and broken, cut through the noise. David, is this true? David's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. Finding none, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mother, I can explain. But Margaret had already turned away, her eyes brimming with tears as she faced James. My boy, I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. James embraced his mother, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding begin to lift. Over her shoulder, he locked eyes with David, seeing not the conniving businessman, but the little brother he'd grown up with. The board chairman's voice boomed across the room. In light of this evidence, I move for the immediate dismissal of David Whitmore, Eli Carter, and Sophia Green from all positions within Whitmore Hotels. A chorus of ayes echoed through the ballroom. As security led David, Eli, and Sophia away, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Lucas, still in his chef's whites, looking both awed and sheepish. Mr. Whitmore, I had no idea. All those things I said to you in the kitchen. James clasped Lucas's shoulder, a genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion. You were honest, Lucas. That's all I ever wanted from my employees. In fact, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about improving conditions for our staff. As the night wore on, James worked tirelessly to calm investors, reassure board members, and begin the long process of rebuilding trust. But even as he shook hands and made promises, his mind kept drifting to David. In a quiet moment, James slipped away from the crowd and made his way to the hotel's holding room. He found David sitting alone, head in his hands. Why, David? James's voice was soft, devoid of anger. We could have ruled this empire together. David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. You don't get it, do you? It was never about the money. It was about stepping out of your shadow, just once. James sank into the chair opposite his brother, the weight of years of unspoken resentment hanging between them. I never meant to overshadow you, David. I thought we were a team. A bitter laugh escaped David's lips. A team. You were the star quarterback, and I was the water boy. Do you have any idea what it's like to always be James Whitmore's little brother? The silence stretched between them, filled with missed opportunities and misunderstandings. Finally, James spoke. What if we could start over? Not as rivals, but as true partners. David's head snapped up, suspicion warring with hope in his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that I forgive you, David, and I'm offering you a chance to make things right. As dawn broke over the city, James stood at the window of his office, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the skyline gold. The door opened softly, and Carla entered, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "The press release is ready," she said, handing him a cup. "Are you sure about this?" James took a sip, savoring the bitter warmth. "I am. It's time for a new chapter in the Whitmore Hotel story." Carla hesitated, then pressed on. "And the part about David, the board won't like it." "The board will have to trust me on this one. David made mistakes, big ones, but he's still my brother. And sometimes the greatest wealth is knowing when to forgive." As Carla left to distribute the press release, James's phone buzzed with a text from David. "Thank you. I won't let you down again." James smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope for the future. He typed out a quick reply. "I know you won't. We're in this together now. For real this time." Tucking his phone away, James straightened his tie and prepared to face the day. There was much work to be done, trust to rebuild, and a hotel empire to run. But for the first time in months, he felt truly optimistic. The Whitmore brothers were back in business, stronger than ever. As James made his way down to the lobby, he was greeted by a sight that warmed his heart. Lucas and the kitchen staff, along with housekeeping and front desk employees, were gathered in a semicircle, their faces a mix of curiosity and hope. Lucas stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, we wanted to thank you for everything you did, for working alongside us. We had no idea." James raised a hand, smiling warmly. "There's no need to thank me, Lucas. If anything, I should be thanking all of you. You showed me what truly makes this hotel great. Its people." A ripple of appreciation ran through the group. James continued, his voice carrying across the lobby. "Which is why, effective immediately, we're implementing a series of changes. Improved working conditions, better pay, and a direct line of communication between staff and management. This hotel isn't just mine, it's ours." The lobby erupted in cheers and applause. As James shook hands and fielded questions, he caught sight of his mother watching from the mezzanine, her eyes shining with pride. Later that afternoon, James found himself back in the kitchen, this time dressed in his usual suit. The staff paused in their work, unsure how to react to their CEO's presence. James rolled up his sleeves and grabbed an apron. "Mind if I lend a hand? I hear the lunch rush can be brutal." Laughter rippled through the kitchen as James took his place at the sink, falling easily into the rhythm he'd learned over the past month. As he worked, he chatted with the staff, learning their names, their stories, their dreams. By the end of the shift, James's suit was splattered with sauce, and his hands were pruned from dishwater. But the smile on his face was genuine, mirrored in the faces of his employees. As the sun set on a day of new beginnings, James made his way to the rooftop garden where David was waiting. The brothers stood side by side, looking out over the city they'd nearly torn apart in their struggle for power. David broke the silence first. "I don't deserve this second chance, James." James turned to his brother, seeing not the man who had betrayed him, but the boy who had once looked up to him with adoration. "Maybe not, but family is about more than just what we deserve. It's about forgiveness, growth, and learning from our mistakes." David nodded, his eyes glistening. "I've got a lot to make up for." "Yes, you do," James agreed. "And you can start by helping me implement these new policies. We're going to make Whitmore Hotels not just the most luxurious chain in the world, but the most ethical and employee-focused too." As they shook hands, sealing their new partnership, James felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be challenging, full of hard work and difficult conversations. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had his brother back. The Whitmore Empire had weathered its greatest storm, emerging stronger, more unified, and with a renewed sense of purpose. As James and David left the rooftop, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, James couldn't help but smile. Blood may be thicker than water, but trust, once broken, was the hardest bond to repair. Yet here they were, taking the first steps on a path of reconciliation and redemption. And in that moment, James knew that the ability to forgive, to grow, to build something greater than themselves. This was the true measure of wealth. The future of Whitmore Hotels was bright, built not just on luxury and profit, but on the unshakable foundation of family, trust, and the simple dignity of honest work. And for James Whitmore, that was the greatest success of all.